Hello everyone. In this presentation, I am going to discuss Fischer effect. We will see what is Fischer effect, how it is related to inflation, inflationary expectations, and what is the impact on the real interest rate with the rise in inflation, and what is nominal interest rate. Before starting my presentation, I request every one of you to please subscribe my channel and share it with your friends. Fischer effect. It is an important economic theory given by an American economist Irving Fisher in 1930. This theory talks about the relationship between the real interest rate, the nominal interest rate, and the rate of inflation. Fisher effect describes the real interest rate, that is R, is equal to the nominal interest rate, that is I, minus the rate of inflation. We can also say that the Fisher effect states that the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the expected inflation rate prevailing in the economy. So here we can see that if there is increase in the inflation, there will be decrease in the real interest rate. And if there is a decrease in the inflation, there will be increase in the real interest rate. So it is easily seen here that the real interest rate is inversely related to the rate of inflation or expected inflation, and it is directly related to the nominal interest rate. So we can say that the real interest rate falls as inflation increases unless the nominal interest rate I also increases at the same rate as inflation, so that the real interest rate remains the same even after the increase in price. To understand Fisher effect more clearly, we must be very clear on some questions. What is inflation? How inflation affects the purchasing power? What is the difference between the nominal value of money and real value of money? And what is the difference between the nominal interest rate and the real interest rate? Inflation, which means the rise in the price level in the economy or the fall in the value of money, that measures how much more expensive our goods and services have become over a certain period of time. That means the price of goods and services has risen and you need more money to buy the same bundle of goods and service. There is a fall in the value of money. Either you buy less of goods and services or you need more money to buy the same bundle of goods and services. The indicators of inflation are consumer price index and wholesale price index. Let's take an example. Suppose you have 10,000 rupees in your pocket. Now, if we take 3 generations for this 10,000 rupees, will this 10,000 rupees is having the same value of money for your grandfather when he was at 40, or for your father at his 40s, or for you when you will be at age of 40? Is the value of money same for all the 3 time periods? The answer is no. Why? Because the price has increased. There has been a continuous increase in the price level in the economy. As a result, the purchasing power of this 10,000 has fallen down. So what is the purchasing power? Purchasing power is the real value of money. That means when we divide this M by the price level in the economy, that is M upon P, that will give you the real value of money, the purchasing power of money. So when your grandfather was at 40s, the size of his basket was much bigger. Your father at 40s, the size of the basket has become smaller, and for you it will be much smaller. This shows that the rise in price or the inflation leads to the fall in the real value of money or the purchasing power of money. As we have discussed, the real interest rate is the difference between the nominal interest rate and the rate of inflation. However, this is an approximate formula. The exact mathematical formula for Fischer effect is the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate upon the rate of inflation. If we rearrange the above formula, we will find the value of nominal interest rate, which is equal to the sum of the real interest rate and the rate of inflation, which is called the Fischer equation. Here, in this formula, we can see that the nominal interest rate changes because of two reasons. It changes with the change in the real interest rate and with the change in the rate of inflation. There is a direct relationship between the inflation rate and the nominal interest rate. If the inflation increases, the nominal interest rate increases. If the inflation decreases, the nominal interest rate decreases. So the Fischer equation tells us to add the real interest rate and the inflation rate together to determine the nominal interest rate for the economy. Let's take some example to understand the Fischer effect more clearly. Case 1. Suppose the nominal interest rate in the economy is 4%. The rate of interest which is offered by the bank on the saving account is 4%. The inflation rate for a given year is 0%. So the real interest rate is 4%, which is the difference between the nominal interest rate and the rate of inflation. Therefore, the real rate of return is 4%. It means that the depositor will be able to buy 4% more of goods and services at the end of the year than at the beginning of the year, as the real rate of return has increased. Now let's take case 2. Here the inflation increases to 4%. Nominal interest rate was 4% as discussed, and the real interest rate now will be equal to 0% because whatever is the nominal interest rate, the inflation has increased equally, and as a result, the real return or real rate of return is 0 on that account. So the purchasing power of the account is no longer greater at the end of the year than in the beginning of the year. Case 3. Suppose the nominal interest rate on the saving account is 4% and the expected rate of inflation is 3%. So the real interest rate on saving account is 1%. That means the real rate of return is only 1%. The depositor will be able to buy only 1% more of goods and services at the end of the year than at the beginning of the year. That clearly shows that smaller the real interest rate, the longer it will take for saving deposit to grow substantially when observed from the purchasing power perspective. Let us take one more example to understand the real interest rate and the Fischer equation. We all know that interest is the reward for parting with liquidity or sacrificing the present consumption. For that sacrifice, we get the reward in terms of interest. That interest is analyzed as a reward in terms of the real interest rate. So we all know that inflation does impact the returns on interest rate. Let's take an example. In June 2020, I borrowed 1 lakh rupee from you for the time period of 2 years, and the rate of interest which I offered to you is 10%. Why I have offered it at 10%? Because I expected the inflation to be less than 10%. On the basis of the past inflation data, I found that the inflation varied between 5 to 7%, so I expected the inflation less than 10% in 2022, and I offered the nominal interest rate of 10%. In 2020, the consumer price index, the measure of inflation, was 6.93. So offering interest, nominal interest of 10% means that if the expected inflation rate is expected at rate of 7%, then the real return would be 3%. That is the nominal interest rate, that is 10%, which I am offering to you, and the inflation which was expected in 2020 for 2022 is 7%. So actually this 3% is the real interest rate or the real rate of return. Now let's come in 2022. In 2022, we have witnessed many economic upheavals in the economy for the last 2 years. There was outbreak of COVID, there was a supply shortage. Because of that, we witnessed the rise in price. And after the COVID, there, there was a war between Russia and Ukraine, which has affected the price of oil, and that has led to further increasing the inflationary pressure across the globe. As a result, in June 2022, the inflation in consumer price index is 9.1%, which is more than what we expected at 7%. So in 2020, our expectations for the inflation was 7%, but in 2022, inflation figure reached to 9.1%. As a result, the real interest rate for 2022 at the time of maturity is only 0.9%. Why? Because 10% was the nominal interest rate which I promised to give you, and the inflation at the time of maturity is 9.1%. That means what you have received in terms of the rate of return is only 0.9%. In 2020, you were expected to receive it at 3%, the on the basis of the inflation expectation of 7%. But in the time of maturity, the inflation has increased and the real rate of return is only 0.9%. So this shows that inflation expectation plays a very important role, as the nominal interest rate I cannot adjust to the actual inflation, because inflation is not known when the nominal interest rate is set. The nominal interest rate can adjust only to the expected rate of inflation. So when I took money, I adjust the nominal interest rate only on the expectations of the inflation. But the situation in 2022 was different, inflation was much higher, and what you have received is much less than what it was expected. So it is very important to have a correct estimate of expected inflation. On that basis, we decide the nominal interest rate. So if there is increase in the inflation expectation, there must be increase in the nominal interest rate in order to increase the real interest rate. So thus, increase in nominal interest rate can help and act as an inflation compensation to give you the reasonable return in terms of the real interest rate. We have already discussed much about the Fischer effect. Now it is pretty clear that the nominal interest rate and the real interest rate both play a very important role in Fischer equation. Fischer effect states that to calculate the real interest rate, you need to subtract the actual or the expected rate of inflation from the nominal interest rate. So let us find out the difference between the nominal interest rate and the real interest rate quickly. Nominal interest rate is the interest rate before taking inflation into account, whereas the real interest rate is the interest rate after taking inflation into account. Nominal interest rate is the rate at which nominal value of an asset increases over time, whereas the real interest rate is the rate at which the real value or the purchasing power of the asset increases over time. Nominal interest rate is the interest rate that banks pay. It is basically interest rate that is prevailing in the market and it paints the picture of current mood of the market. Whereas the real interest rate represents the purchasing power of investor. That is the real rate of return. Another important feature of nominal interest rate is that it cannot adjust to actual inflation. Why? Because actual inflation is not known when the nominal interest rate is set or calculated. It is based on the expected inflation. The nominal interest rate can adjust only to expected inflation. In our example, we have adjusted the nominal interest rate on the basis of expected inflation for 2022. So in 2020, we calculated the nominal interest rate on the basis of expected inflation. So the equation for the nominal interest rate is real interest rate plus expected inflation. If we see the real interest rate is of two types, ex ante and ex post. Ex ante real interest rate equation is nominal interest rate minus expected inflation. Basically, it is talking about the expected inflation. Ex ante means anticipated inflation. So it is based on expectations. And ex post real interest rate means nominal interest rate minus actual inflation. So in this case, we all remember it's very important point that there are two real interest rate. Ex ante real interest rate, that is anticipated real interest rate. It is based on expected inflation, and ex post real interest rate, which is based on the inflation, the actual inflation prevailing at that time. It is important to keep in mind that when a borrower and a lender agree on a nominal interest rate, they do not know what the inflation rate over the term of loan will be. In our example, I promised to pay you 10% nominal interest rate in 2020. But in 2020, we were not knowing the actual inflation over the next 2 years. That actual inflation plays a very important role in affecting the real interest rate or the real rate of return. Therefore, we must distinguish between the two concepts of real interest rate, that is ex ante real interest rate and ex post real interest rate. The real interest rate that the borrower and lender expect when the loan is made is called ex ante real interest rate, whereas the real interest rate that is actually realized is called the ex post real interest rate. Ex ante real interest rate is based on the expected inflation, and it is written as the nominal interest rate minus expected inflation, whereas the ex post real interest rate is based on the actual inflation, that is actual inflation at the time of maturity, which is written as nominal interest rate minus actual inflation. So in our example, when I borrowed 1 lakh rupee from you in June 2020, I calculated the expected inflation on the basis of past experience at 7%, and I promised to pay you 10% as a nominal interest rate. So what is your real interest rate or real rate of return? It is 3%. The ex ante real rate of return is 3%. But at the time of maturity, in June 2022, there was a sharp increase in the price. The inflation comes in and the actual inflation rate was 9.1%, which was much higher than the expected inflation. Since I promised you to pay 10% nominal interest rate, so now your real interest rate or ex post real interest rate, that is the real rate of return, is only 0.9%. So you can see here, when our expected inflation was 7%, your ex ante real interest rate was 3%. That is 3% was the real rate of return. But at the time of maturity, when we got the figure of actual inflation of 9.1%, your real interest rate or ex post real rate of return fell down to 0.9%. This clearly shows that the two real interest rates differ when actual inflation differ from expected inflation. Why? Because when the loan is made, the borrower and a lender cannot predict the future inflation with certainty. They do have some expectations about what the inflation rate will be on the basis of past experience. Inflationary expectation therefore plays a very important role in deciding the real rate of return or the real interest rate. It is the rate at which people expect the price to rise in the future. It is an opinion on the future inflation rate from different sections of society. Inflationary expectation helps investor, banker, government, central banks, workers, consumers, businessmen to take decisions concerning various economic activities that they would like to undertake in future. Therefore, if there is the expectation of rising price or inflationary expectation, the nominal interest rate should increase enough so that the real rate of return should remain high even after inflation. So this increase in the nominal interest rate is a kind of inflation compensation so that the real interest rate should not be sacrificed even after inflationary expectation. So in the same way, you must have heard about a DNS allowance, which is paid by the government to its employees and pensioners. It is added to the basic salary to offset the impact of inflation. And
compensate its employees from the adverse effect of inflation.
The one-for-one relationship between inflation and nominal interest rate. As the nominal interest rate is equal to the real interest rate plus expected inflation. So Fischer equation states that a 1% increase in the inflation causes a 1% increase in the nominal interest rate. That means if there is an increase in the inflation, there must be increase in the nominal interest rate so that the real interest rate or the real return should not be sacrificed. So increase in the real interest rate can be considered as inflation compensation. This one-for-one relationship between inflation and the nominal interest rate is called Fischer effect. The nominal interest rate moves one-for-one with the change in expected inflation. Here, the Fischer equation states that the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus expected inflation rate. That means when the real interest rate is positive, it means the lender or investor is able to beat inflation. How? Because in this situation, nominal interest rate increases equally with the increase in the inflation. So the real interest rate is protected and the investor is able to beat inflation. But when the real interest rate is negative, it means the rate of return on saving account is not beating inflation. Why? Because here in this situation, the nominal interest rate has not increased with the increase in the inflation in the economy. As a result, the real interest rate is sacrificed. If you have any question on this presentation, please put your question in the comment section and like and subscribe my channel to get further notification. Thank you so much.